So tonight we're going to continue looking at Romans, and our theme for tonight is unity in the church. That's what Paul is talking about as he begins to close out his letter. Next week we're going to finish up the book of Romans. We're also going to have a time of prayer, have communion. So make sure you're here next week as we do that. But as Paul starts, he's talking about two main points of contention in the church. And as you look at it and as you read his other letters, you're going to see that it's not just Rome that struggles with this, but it struggles throughout some of the different churches in the area. And the two areas are food and drink and the Sabbath. Maybe not something that you expect. But whenever he's looking at problems in the church, there was two things that kind of stood out at that point. One was the strict diet of the Jewish people versus the lenient diet of the Gentiles. So it's this whole idea of what people can eat and what they can't. And the second one was the Sabbath and how the Jews regarded Saturday as that special day, that day of rest. And again, they had those strict rules. And the other followers weren't really following it. Now, I don't know, you might be thinking, well, I don't know if that's really a problem that we have, anything that we struggle with, but you will find that a lot of these things, these ideas that he's talking about are going to carry over into the church today, because if you haven't noticed, sometimes we squabble about things that aren't exactly the most important. Matter of fact, I have a list of 20 things that churches have thought about, they've argued about, some have even split about, and I'm going to read through these. The first one is there was an argument over the appropriate length of the worship pastor's beard. I'm glad Connor kind of trimmed his, shortened it up. There you go. But they were fighting about that length. Another one was they fought over whether to build a children's playground or use the land for a cemetery. A church dispute of whether or not to install restroom stall dividers in the women's restroom. I don't know if I've ever been to a women's restroom without those, so I don't know why they were fighting. A church argument and vote to decide if a clock in the worship center should be removed. A 45-minute heated argument over the type of filing cabinet to purchase, whether it was black or brown and 2, 3, or 4 drawers. 45 minutes to make that decision. A dispute over whether the worship leader should have his shoes on during service. Now, I don't know about you, but I have been to a church where everybody takes their shoes off as they come in. You know, it's considered holy and stuff, but I could see a worship leader standing up there barefoot with his really long beard and people getting a little uncomfortable. There was a big church argument over the discovery that the church budget was off by a dime, and it was finally resolved when someone just gave 10 cents to settle it. There was a dispute in the church because the Lord's Supper had cran grape juice instead of grape juice. And there was a business meeting arguments about whether the church should purchase a weed eater or not, and it took 2 business meetings to resolve over whether or not to buy a weed eater. 2 business meetings. Arguments over what type of green beans the church should serve. Arguments over moving to a stronger blend of coffee, and members even left the church because of it. There was a major conflict when the youth borrowed a crock pot that had not been used for years. I might have attended one of those churches, I'm just saying. An argument on whether the church should allow deviled eggs at the church meal. An argument over who has the authority to buy postage stamps for the church. A disagreement over using the term potluck instead of pot blessing. And a church member was chastised because she brought vanilla syrup to the coffee server because it looked too much like liquor. An argument in church over who has access to the copy machine. So some church members left the church because one church member hid the vacuum cleaner from them, and it resulted in a major fight and split. A dispute over whether the church should allow people to wear black t-shirts, since black is the color of the devil. We all know that. And last but not least, I saved this for last. An argument over whether to have gluten-free communion bread or not. Thank you for allowing us to have gluten-free communion bread. We'll be having some of that next week. So those are some things that churches have thought about. And so we look at this idea of whether or not to eat the food, drink the drink of that time, and we say, whatever, we don't do those foolish things when all the time the church does. And that's what Paul is addressing in this chapter. We're going to start reading in verse 14. This is what he says in verse 1. He says, "Accept him whose faith is weak, without passing judgment on disputable matters. One man's faith allows him to eat everything, but another man whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. The man who eats everything must not look down on him who does not, and the man who does not eat everything must not condemn the man who does, for God has accepted him." The first thing that we have to realize when we want unity in the church, what Paul is saying is that we can't pass judgment. We're not called to pass judgment. Now, he's focusing on food here. He's making this point that all food is clean. And he goes in 1 Corinthians 8, he addresses it again to the church in Corinth. And he even talks about food sacrificed to idols. And what he says, food does not bring us close to God, and there's only one God. So it doesn't matter where it came from. It doesn't matter what it is. It's okay. And so he's saying, do not judge when others aren't doing what you think they should do. Don't get preoccupied with the little things. Understand that people are going to do things differently. People are going to have different convictions. It doesn't mean that you're wrong. It just means that people have different preferences and different perceptions sometimes. In verse 14, he says, "I am convinced, being fully persuaded in the Lord Jesus, that nothing is unclean in itself. But if anyone regards something as unclean, then for that person it is unclean." So he's saying it has less to do with the circumstances, it has less to do with what it is, and more to do with our own convictions and our own conscience. It's more to do with our own relationship with God. Mike Bird, in his commentary on Romans, he actually listed 3 levels of importance when talking about this. Because obviously there's different things in the church that has significance. And the first one is the essentials for salvation. And obviously those are important. Those we have to have agreement on. Whether you acknowledge Jesus as the Son of God, whether the repentance of sin and all of those things. I mean, he's not saying that those are negotiable. Because we understand that those are truths. But that's the first level of importance. There's a second level of importance that has to do with the faith in the church. Our theological beliefs. It might not be essential for salvation, but theological, the Bible talks about this. And we saw that in previous chapters when Paul talks about sexual immorality and drunkenness and even jealousy and things like that. But there's this third category that's basically debatable non-essentials and preferences. And the thing about it is we get these 2 categories, category 2 and 3, mixed up sometimes. Like stuff kind of gets pushed up a little bit higher than really what it's supposed to be. When stuff should be really down in that debatable non-essentials or preferences. I did look up to see what some of the most controversial topics in the church are. And honestly, when you look at this list and they fall in different categories, and some of them are really important and some of them aren't nearly as important. But these are considered the 8 most controversial topics in the church. Gay marriage, abortion, women in leadership, types of worship music, spiritual gifts and how we use them, baptism and the significance of it, politics from the pulpit, and alcohol. Those are the 8 most controversial things that the church faces today. And sometimes, like I said, they're important, and sometimes they're not nearly that important as we place on them. But what really strikes me whenever we look at what Paul is saying here is verse 2. In verse 2, Paul says, "One man's faith allows him to eat everything, but another man whose faith is weak eats only vegetables." See, normally we think that the closer we get to God, the stronger our faith is, the more strict we become. But Paul actually is saying the opposite. Did you catch it? The man whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. He's saying that the more strict in the non-essential areas is typically how a weaker Christian functions. They're more strict because we don't understand God's grace. And the closer we move to God, the more we realize that God's grace abounds. And so we don't get caught up on those things. There's a book that I've been meaning to read. I got it, I pulled it out today and read a chapter or 2. It's a little, getting started on it was a little rough, but I really want to finish reading. It's called Pharisectomy. And he talks about not just like people that were born and raised in church, not people who, are old school or anything like that, but he talks about how Christians in general, even the more progressive and liberal Christians, have things that they pick up, that they carry, and sometimes a hill that they are ready to die on that really aren't the significance. It's not the focus. It's not what God is calling us to do. And can I tell you, I really had to ponder my list of things. I really had to ponder some of those things and think about all these things that sometimes I feel like my relationship with God hinders on. Is it truly that significant? Because what happens is we get so caught up on the things that we do that we lose sight of the relationship that we have with God. One of the things that he says in the book, he says, the Bible isn't a list of requirements. Rather, it's a list of results after experiencing God's love. Too many times we see this list of requirements, this list of restrictions, this list of do's and don'ts. And we want to die on that hill because we think it's correct, when really it's about loving God. Does that mean that we won't do those things? Sometimes, yeah. It means we don't. In 1 Corinthians 10, Paul says, I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. I tell you, Jesus said his yoke is easy and his burden is light. Do you truly feel that? Because sometimes as we walk with God, we have a tendency to pick up more and pick up more until the burden is so heavy that we feel weighed down. We ponder it and we scrutinize over everything on if this is correct or if this is right and all of that. And in the midst of trying to figure it all out, we lose sight of what's truly important. We lose sight of God's love and his mercy. And when we can begin to let go of all of those what ifs and this and that's, I can tell you, our burden becomes light. It becomes easy. God didn't mean for our walk with him to be so heavy to where we're afraid we're going to make the wrong step. He meant for us to have peace and joy, lightheartedness. That's what the Christian walk is. But as he said in there, he said, no one should seek their own good, but the good of others. Paul's second point is do not cause another to stumble. So he doesn't want us to judge, but he also doesn't want us to cause someone else to stumble. In verse 13, he says, therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead of passing judgment, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. So first he's telling us we have liberty, we have freedom in Christ, but we also have to express love. And that love means that we try to live our lives so that others will see God through us. And sometimes that means not doing those things that we know are okay. Paul again talked about in Corinthians, when he talked about it's okay to eat those foods, he said, but you know what? If the people that invite you, if they know they were sacrificed to idols, and so they're going to see you doing that and be like, whoa, wait, what are they doing? Then you know what? Don't eat it. Even though it's okay to eat it, don't do it. Because you don't want to lead others astray. You don't want them to get the wrong idea. That's why the Assemblies of God, they have this stance against drinking. As a pastor, I say I'm not going to drink. And they say it's what the idea behind it. They know that, you know what, having a drink of alcohol isn't a sin. Now, drunkenness, Paul talks about that. Drunkenness is a sin, and we're not supposed to be drunk. But if you have a glass of wine or something with dinner, I mean, at the end of the day, the Bible doesn't talk about that. There's nothing wrong with that. But in our society and in our culture, people see that, and they come to the wrong idea. Because the idea of alcohol and alcoholism and all those things in our society brings this whole stigma with it. And so they say, you know what? Let's not cause another brother to stumble. That's why we don't drink. Now, when missionaries go to these foreign countries, and it's customary and it's just tradition for them to have a glass of wine with dinner, they're okay for missionaries to do that. Because it's not setting a bad example. It's not giving the wrong idea. That's what Paul is talking about here. Living our lives so that we are truly showing God. Understand there are many things that are no longer an offense to God, but they're an offense to man. And so our walk should be a testimony for others. Our walk shouldn't make other people stumble. They shouldn't see us doing something like, oh, well, that's okay, so I'm going to do it. Even if God says it's okay, that doesn't mean that it's good for us. It doesn't mean that we should do it. It doesn't mean that it's beneficial. And so a couple of quotes. One of the books that I read is Exalting Jesus in Romans. And Tony Merida, in it, he writes, freedoms can be taken up, but they may also be put down. If you cannot put a freedom down, you are enslaved to that thing rather than enjoying it rightly. Understand, just like Paul is saying, just because it's good, or just because we can do it doesn't mean it's good. We can pick up a freedom, but we have to be willing to throw it down as well. Otherwise, that freedom can begin to entrap us. It can begin to enslave us. There's another quote. It says, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, charity. In essentials, in those things that are essential to the church, those ideas of salvation, those theological ideas, we have to be united. We have to understand them. We have to stand together on them. But in those non-essential areas, we have to give liberty. People have different convictions. They're on a different growth journey. We have to give liberty, but in all things charity. Typically in the Bible, when it uses that word charity, it means love. In all things, we love one another. That brings us unity in the church. And point 3, we must grow strong in order to help those who are weak. We must grow strong in order to help those who are weak. In Romans 15, starting in verse 1, Paul writes, we who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Each of us should please his neighbor for his good and to build him up. For even Christ did not please himself, but it is written, the insults of those who insult you have fallen on me. Understand that a lot of times in our Christian walk, we become stagnant. We end up not growing. We become complacent. It's easy just to kind of get in the habit of life, to begin to go through things and just have the humdrum of daily walk. In and out. You know, we have ducks at the house. We have a little pond for them. It's not like in the ground, but it's a thing that sticks up, and we don't have any running water through it. So understand it doesn't take long for that pond to get gross and scummy. We have to change that water out several times a week. Because whenever stuff isn't moving, whenever things aren't changing, then that's what happens. You get that gross scum and mold and everything that grows up on top. And in our walk with Christ, if we don't continue to move, if we don't continue to grow, then honestly, it just gets a stench. It just gets slimy and gross. That's why people have all these fountains and these ponds and stuff. It keeps it moving. We have to keep moving in our Christian walk in order to keep growing. We have to keep studying the Word. We have to keep praying. And understand that we're going to continue to grow. You don't get to this point where you're like, oh, I'm good. You don't get to a point where you're like, you know what, I get it. I understand everything this says. Like I said, whenever I was reading this, whenever I was studying it, I had to stop and I had to ponder some of those things that I carry, that I sit there and I scrutinize. And I wonder and I pray about. And say, you know what? Am I holding on to some of those things too tightly? Am I stressing about some of these things that really aren't that significant? When we have people in our community who are dying and going to hell, when we have people who are struggling with addiction, why am I so focused on the little things when the big things are out there that I should be praying about, that I should be out there telling others about Jesus? But we have to continue to challenge ourselves and look at the Word. Can I tell you that you're going to continue to be challenged in the Word? One of those reasons is because we just can't completely grasp it. We can't learn and understand it all. Can I tell you, like I went back and looked at sermons that I preached a year or two ago, and I'm like, wow, I didn't even remember that. Wow, what did I say? What did I talk about? I was talking with my brother and getting a little bit of a spiritual debate, and like he's saying these certain things, and I'm like, okay, let me go back and look at that and realize, oh yeah, I preached about that. Oh, but you know, I preached about this topic and I preached about that topic, but I really didn't bring them together to kind of see it from that view. And now I can see that. You know, there's just so much in the Word that we have to continue studying it. But secondly, we're constantly getting thrown all these ideas from the world around us. And sometimes those ideas from the world start to get mixed in with our theology because we're just bombarded with it. You know, we spend our little time studying the Word, doing a devotion and things like that, and then we walk out into the world and we have people, we have TV, we have Facebook, we have Instagram, TikTok, everything coming in and telling us all of these other things that are against the Word or that's twisting the Word. So we have to go back to the true Word to make sure that we get it right, so that we can grow, so that we can help others to grow. It's not even for ourselves, it's so that we can help others. We have to make sure we keep growing. But understand that we have a tendency to grow a lot slower than what we think as well. We have a tendency to feel like, you know what, I'm feeling the power of God. You know, I've heard from Him today, and man, I'm just on my way. And then the next day comes and we feel like we're shot down. And understand, growth takes years. After Paul had his conversion on the road to Damascus, he didn't go out on his missionary journey and do all this stuff. There's actually a 3-year time span that you don't really hear anything about Paul. He went back and studied, learned from others, and he grew. And as a matter of fact, it was, they think, about 20 years after his conversion that he wrote Romans. 20 years. And he saw Jesus. Like on the road to Damascus, like he saw Him. He had that experience. But he still had to take the time to grow. He still had to take that time. And when we recognize that it takes us time, then we'll start to recognize that it's going to take others as well. We're not all running trying to think of something fast. 6 miles per hour? I might not think that's fast. For me, it's a little fast, I'm just saying. Some of us are on a slower walk. Let's go about 3 miles per hour right now, you know? But what the important thing is that we're growing. And we can look back and we can see that growth. You know, we got a puppy and we've only had her for 2 weeks, and she's already taller than our other dog. Like we don't see her, we see her every day, and we don't look at her and be like, oh, look, she's growing. But as soon as she stands next to Camilla, we're like, oh, she's probably grown an inch in 2 weeks because she's taller than our other dog now. And that's kind of how the Christian walk is. You don't always realize it. You feel great at times, other times you don't. But whenever you get a little ways down the road, you look back and like, oh, wow, I'm growing. I'm maturing. So I can help others. And then he continues on. Verse 5. It says, may the God who gives endurance and encouragement give you the same attitude of mind toward each other that Christ had. That same attitude of mind. If we want unity in the church, we have to have that same attitude of mind. Christ was humble, he was thoughtful, he was sacrificial, purposeful, obedient, patient. I mean, it's kind of easier to get this list of do's and don'ts sometimes because these other things they're eternal. They're attitude changing. They're growing in patience and obedience. Those other things we can just quit doing or do what we need to do, but these other things take time to grow. That's what we're called to do. And then he ends, or I'm ending rather, with verse 7. He says, accept one another then, just as Christ accepted you, in order to bring praise to God. Worship team, you can go ahead and come back up. Because we're ending where we began, with that acceptance. When we learn that acceptance, then we begin to have unity in the church, unity among the believers. And that's how Paul said people would recognize us, our love for each other. When we have that love for each other, then we truly begin to become the church. And that's what we're called to do. Heavenly Father, Lord,